I don't know, and I can't remember if I've spoken about this with either of you gentlemen. I brought it up last week, and I don't know if it'll surprise you that my dad worked for the IRS for 24 years, from 1967 to 1991. Worked in the transition. He was an auditor, IRS Service Center in Austin, Texas, transitioned to data processing, then to information systems in that age of the 80s when that was occurring. He was the director of tax systems modernization in the late 1980s. Came up here and testified a number of times, talking about what Congressman Massey was talking about. At that time, tapes were still being flown from service centers to the Martinsburg Computing Center and the Detroit Data Center for processing, right? And then obviously, internet and all this started changing everything. I bring that up only to say, you know, I grew up like kind of studying tax policy, studied the flat tax, studied, you know, the national sales tax, or, you know, whatever you want to call fair tax, or different ways you talk about these different alternatives, because it always just struck me that there's very little way, as I watched my dad and we go look at this in terms of data processing, collecting information, to go get every single, particularly rich person in big corporations, get every dollar that they owe when you can't get agreement by any one accountant with another accountant with another accountant is exactly what they owe in a very complex code that is stacked up how high if we stack it up here. I say that not as a, you know, one thing or another. It's like, you know, I hear we got $400 or $500 billion that you could go collect of evaded taxes right across the entire possibility right now. I guess I bring that up, and I'm not trying to be flippant here. The gentleman from Maryland said something in the zip code of nickel and dimes, right, in terms of what we're trying to do here with respect to discretionary spending, which I assume the gentleman means relative to mandatory spending and other issues that are kind of blowing a lid off the budget. I know the gentleman from Arkansas, we've talked about that issue a number of times. That all is just to set the baseline for saying, well, nickel and dimes, well, all we're talking about with the IRS expansion, according to the own estimates, is spending $80 billion to raise $200 billion over 10 years. That's what they budgeted for, as the CBO has said, would be the result of that. To go basically claw out $12 billion a year over 10 years. I'm simple straight line math of $120 billion net of the $80 billion you spend. So that to me is kind of the definition of nickel and dime. Now, maybe that's targeting people that we want to target. We target like rich people or something. But then I think the gentlemen know, right, according to Stanford, black taxpayers 3 to 5 times more likely to be audited. 50% of the IRS total audits went to families making less than $25,000 under the EITC. I assume that the response is, yeah, well, we need to make the systems better so we can go target the rich people. Okay, but this year, I mean, since Biden has taken over, interest rates have gone up 5 percentage points, 500 basis points. An increase in 100 basis points is $187 billion of additional interest. In other words, so I hear you. Okay, I don't want anybody who otherwise owes X on their tax bill to avoid paying X under the law. We're members of Congress. We want people to follow the law. But I would just posit that one of the reasons we're saying we should grab money from a $75 billion or whatever the number is of dollars sitting there for the Internal Revenue Service money to pay for something now, be it Israel, be it some of the stuff in here from a rescission standpoint to go back to 22 levels, is because you're going to save money in real terms in these dollars here, and the actual benefit you're going to get, you're going to be targeting a whole lot of non-rich people in order to squeeze blood out of a turnip that you're going to blow through in a matter of seconds with interest on your debt relative to what you're actually saving, and trying to get the IRS to go out and target American citizens to get money, when in my view, you're going to do far better if you just simplify the tax code and then hold people accountable. You have a highly complex code. Then we get into depreciation and asset expenditures and all the things that make our code more complex. So the point of that is to say, when we get back to the FRA, because a lot of things have been said about what we're spending or not spending, and this is a genuine question. My friend from Arkansas, my understanding right now, right, the FRA levels would be 1590, right? That would be the FRA top line level. Right now, if I understand where we're headed toward 1584 if we would adhere to what we've currently laid out for all of the appropriations bills that have come forward, and this bill would fit within that. Is that right?
With rescissions.
Yes. Yeah. Well, but 1584 would be the top line number we would get with actual spendings, and then there's rescissions that would bring that lower, right, in terms of getting things back to certain spending levels overall. But the top line programmatic levels are still going to be 1584 if we stick to where we currently are, right?
In that neighborhood, yeah.
Yeah, about a little over a 1% cut off of 2023's omnibus spending, right? The reason I bring that up is people talking about, well, we're breaking the deal with the FRA, or, I mean, my general view is like Labor H is still sitting out there to be dealt with, and that's 40 billion of the cuts, 39.6 billion, whatever it is. The odds of getting 30.6 billion are probably not high. You know, my point being, you get 33 billion of those 39 billion cuts agreed to, which I bet is going to be a difficult lift through the body. But you're just going to hit the FRA level in actuality. And we could disagree about whether we should cut more from FSGG than from Labor H or whatever, but the fact is we're actually trying to adhere to the FRA, which was agreed to, as the gentleman said. Like, some of us want more, Senator, the gentleman from Maryland.
Steny's fine.
I'd love to cut more. I mean, because I want government to be smaller. I'm no surprise there from anybody. But the fact is, though, as a body, that's actually where we're headed. There are rescissions, yes, being claimed to sort of push the overall spending levels down. But the programmatic levels, it's basically the FRA levels from a programmatic standpoint at 1590, assuming Labor H comes in somewhere like 33 or 34 billion. So, yes, that's defense up 28, non-defense, non-veteran down, whatever, 8% across the board, or whatever that number would be. It varies. And yes, my colleagues on the other side of the aisle don't like that, but that was the FRA rough agreement, right? 28 billion up for defense, find a way to get the rest of it down. The dirty little secret, and this is my question, right, is that some of the hope in getting that deal done was that there would be rescissions used to backfill that. Right, the $22 billion account sitting over at Commerce wasn't put over there just for, grins. And so I think my question is just straight up, is that, am I accurate in my characterization of that? I'd ask both of you openly, because I look at the Senate, somebody brought up, the Senate, they've been shooting straight. Well, they threw a $14 billion emergency spending deal right on top of it in July. When they put out their message, it was going to be $14 billion of additional emergency spending. I don't see that as adhering to the FRA. My point is would the gentleman from Arkansas agree that depending on how Labor H plays out at CJS, which is a smaller cut, it's what, $2 billion, we're pretty in line with the FRA programmatic levels. Is that wrong? Is that wrong to characterize it that way?
I don't think it's totally wrong. We get into a discussion about how to treat rescissions,
sure,
in comparatively to the baseline of the budget. But I think your premise is correct in that in that we are doing our best to fund the government at a responsible level, realizing that we're not going to be able to balance the books of the federal government on the discretionary budget alone, but that we have to start somewhere. And I think any rational taxpayer watching this proceeding right now would say, you've got to start somewhere, and you have to be able to, if you're going to use any kind of cuts in order to be able to get to a reasonable balance, that most of the agencies are going to be affected, whether you want to call it nickel and diming it or not. But I do think it's just a misnomer to assert that the cuts that we are asking for in this in the FSGG portion of this budget, maybe not with some of the others, but certainly with ours, is going to render an agency unable to fulfill its mission, right, not be able to serve the American public. I think that would be a wrong thing to assert.
For clarification, because it's actually important, I'm genuinely trying to understand. So, in the FRA, the agreement was there'd be an auto kick-in, right, if a CR is in place through into, I think it's April 30th, as it turns out, the way it's written.
Into the year.
Right, into next year, right?
If all 12 appropriation bills are not signed into law by the end of this year, then sometime between January and the end of April, it would trigger a 1% sequester.
Correct.
That's the language of Mr. Massey.
Massey's, the language that's added to the FRA. And so that number would put it at roughly 1586, right? The 1% cut off of last year's numbers through the 23 years of the omnibus. So That would be 1586. The FRA numbers were like 1590, I think. And my question is, are we not, in terms of what we're spending, so the American people understand, whether you think defense should be up $28 billion and non-defense should be cut in order to achieve that spending level, or whether you believe that if we fail to do our job with the appropriations bills, a 1% automatic sequester should kick in which case defense would get whacked 1%.
No,
but,
4.5.
well, relative to its increase. No, but over 23, defense would be whacked 1% and non-defense would be whacked 1% instead of 8%, roughly. These are rough numbers. That in truth, that's what we're talking about here. Programmatic level, it's a debate. We're adhering within rounding errors when you're talking about $1.586 trillion of a couple $1 billion. We're adhering to roughly the programmatic levels, and it's only a debate of allocating that money across all those programs. Is that not roughly correct?
I think that's roughly correct, and then it becomes Congress's decision as to where to apply cuts. You know,
Right.
Are you going to hold defense harmless? You're going to hold Milcon VA harmless? You're going to hold Homeland Security harmless? And you're going to take the rest of it out of the others? I think that is ultimately what is being decided in the appropriations
So
process.
from a conservative standpoint, I might criticize it to say we're only cutting probably less than 1% across the entire FY23 to get to this year for FY24, if we're even successful. If you know, from the other side, you're like, well, it might depend on whether you're a defense or non-defense. And I just think it's important for us to be accurate about how we're characterizing this. Because, for example, the gentleman from Maryland was talking about, I think, some of the bigger problems we face. Some of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle in this committee have raised questions about when we put forward a debt commission. So without getting into the weeds of what the language of is in said debt commission, I'm open to ideas on that. But the concept of a debt commission is being roundly criticized by some of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle as a de facto path to cutting Social Security or Medicare. So my question is, if this is peanuts or nickel and diming to figure out how to get discretionary spending levels when it's $1.6 trillion down, and we can't talk about a debt commission or some other model on a bipartisan basis to deal with the fact that mandatory spending is absolutely off the charts, including burn pits, by the way, which I get roasted for voting against a bill that I thought was a mistake to put it in the mandatory accounts, even though my heart bleeds for our men and women in uniform who suffer from and are victims from burn pits. But here we sit. And I guess my question for both gentlemen is, do you support the concept of a debt commission? Or if so, and if it's not a gotcha, is it, how do we go about approaching that 2/3 or whatever it is of our budget?
Good question. I support the concept of a debt commission, but before then,
Yeah.
I'd go a step further. I would demand a fiscal State of the Union. I would argue, just me, that a fiscal State of the Union would mean a lot more to the American public in that on a Tuesday night in February than the current State of the Union that we normally hear. Because we need to know what the problem is. And the Comptroller General of the United States of America ought to stand in front of the Congress as a whole and detail the fiscal state of this union. And until, because Chip, that's the only way I think that the American public are ever going to fully realize the difference between what we're trying to do on discretionary spending and the relation between discretionary spending to the overall budget. I think that's the only way we're ever going to be able to establish with the American public that this is really not the issue. The bigger issue is on the mandatory side, and we have to have buy-in from the American public so that Congress can have the courage to be able to do what it takes to rein in mandatory spending with whatever solutions will be offered. So I support debt commission. I would support a fiscal State of the Union. Fiscal State of the Union was one of the products that we were producing in the Joint Select Committee on Budget Process Reform. If the American public doesn't understand the problem, and right now we're trying to make the problem discretionary spending. That's all they hear about. That's all we fight about right now. We never talk about mandatory spending. But we talk about discretionary spending, and right now, if Republicans had their way, we would be trimming, what was the number, $115 billion off of the FY23 numbers? That's what we were trying to get to. $115 billion in relation to a $2 trillion deficit is, qualifies probably as maybe a little bigger than a rounding error.
Would the gentleman agree? And actually, well, I don't want to say,
Or
Steny,
nickel diamond.
Steny, can you answer the question about that, the broader question, not a gotcha format, not whatever, not Dem Republican, like, how are we going to do this? I mean, the gentleman puts forward an idea, and it's not a new one. He's talked about it before. The debt commission we've talked about, and just throwing it out here, it's been pilloried in here as you just want to go cut Social Security and Medicare. And we say, well, it's a debt commission. It's just acknowledging that we're racking up debt. So what do we want to do about it? And everybody here, if we're honest, would go to the steps and say, well, we got mandatory spending with Medicare, Social Security, now veterans is in that account. Go down the list, Medicaid. So what are the gentleman's thoughts? I mean, on how we address that? Because I hear that, I disagree a little bit on the discretionary side. I think it's important to check in a quarter of our budget in terms of the size and scope of the bureaucracy for a variety of policy reasons. But from a financial, fiscal health perspective, of course, the drivers right now are mandatory.
You've asked a lot of
I know.
questions.
The main question is like the bigger picture.
Let me say, I have supported debt commissions. A debt deal was made that would have garnered billions of dollars in reduction of deficit. It was made by Obama and Boehner. And it was rejected out of hand because it included revenues. It was a balanced program. For the most part, I think the premise of most of the Republicans I talked to, a debt commission is only about cutting and not about revenues or collection. Seems to be dismissive that IRS after IRS director, Republican and Democrats, secretaries of Treasury, both Republicans and Democrats, agree that greater collection efforts will result in returns of 2, 3, 4, as much as 12 to 1 for a dollar spent on collection, on enforcement. And very frankly, I want enforcement, if you're on the 4% or 5%, 10% bracket, or you're the 28%, or you're 36%, or whatever the percentage may be. I don't want anybody to cheat on their taxes, either $1 or $1 million or $1 billion. Why? Because I think patriotic Americans who pay voluntarily their taxes, and most of them don't have much option because we take it from them as soon as they earn it, want people to pay their fair share. So the answer to your question is that certainly we ought to be looking. But I agree 100% with Steve. The time and effort spent on this floor on, and when I say nickel diming, all of us know we're talking billions of dollars. That's real money for real taxpayers. So I don't want anybody to be misled by my comment. But it is the mote in the eye as opposed to the splinter that we ought to be looking at. We're looking at the splinter. And the splinter is discretionary spending. That doesn't mean it's not important. And what the Appropriations Committee ought to do and the Congress ought to do is not argue, does it work? And if it doesn't work, we ought to eliminate it. If it does work, and it does serve the American people, and it does protect Americans, then we ought to spend it.
Does the gentleman think, genuine question, that mandatory spending ought to be mandatory rather than each year we look at $7 trillion and decide on a discretionary basis how we're managing our budget like a normal business does?
No, I think mandatory spending is appropriate so that people can rely on that spending. But what I'm saying is, it is not honest with the American people to pretend that we can deal with a relatively small part of the budget, because we don't deal with the defense budget. We know we need to have national security, and therefore we increase it and make sure that we are the best in the world so we can protect ourselves and our allies. I would say as an aside, including Ukraine as well as Israel. But when, frankly, and a number of you have said that, pretend that we took $12.5 billion or $14 billion out of $28 billion for Israel, which is always a emergency funding when they're at war. And when CBO tells us that cost us $12.5 billion of additional revenues that we would have received, according to CBO, if in fact that money had been available for enforcement. I don't think that's very helpful with the debate for the American people, because they get all confused by our argument, your argument. What is not confusing is what your chairman has said, what Mr. Womack has just said, is we need to look at 100% of our expenditures. Not because we want to undermine either Social Security or Medicare, but because we understand that not to look at all those expenditures and try to make sure that people are taken care of, and at the same time we get to a budget that we can live with, would be
if the
dishonest
gentleman,
with them.
I would just make 2 points, and then I'll turn it over, is with respect to a debt commission, then, it would be helpful if our colleagues on the other side of the aisle would talk about how to make that effective or some other variations, as opposed to reflexively dismissing the notion of a debt commission as a part of any package we put together as being somehow specifically designed to cut a program, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, veterans benefits, as opposed to making determinations on how to make it work. Like, my view is we just got to get healthcare prices down. I got a lot of thoughts how to do that. If you want to save Medicare, you want to save veterans benefits, you want to deal with Medicaid, you've got to get those prices down. We'll talk about that separately.
We tried to do that, by the way, and matter of fact, we did do it in the Inflation Reduction Act.
Debate for another day about what that's done to oncology drugs when you price fix, and drugs that saved my life and other things else. I'll let Dr. Burgess talk about that. On the revenue stream, one thing, gentlemen, would the gentleman from Arkansas agree with me that whatever one's view is on tax collection and tax evasion and what we get out of IRS spending, or tax policy, whether it's the criticism from our colleagues on the other side of the aisle about the so-called Trump tax cuts of 2017, that we are currently at roughly 19% federal receipts as a percentage of gross domestic product, that puts it at among the 3 highest levels of receipts as a percentage of gross domestic product in the history of our nation. Once would have been in 1946, right after World War II. The other was 1999, when we had some bipartisan agreements in the 90s, coupled with an internet boom economy. And then now, where we've got in that range of 19 to 20% as a percentage of GDP. My point being, the extent to which we need to go squeeze blood out of the turnip to go find tax dollars, and I agree that everybody should pay what's owed. Side note being, what's owed, again, is in the eye of the beholder for every accountant.
What
right?
we say.
Well, I know,
That's what's owed.
But when 5 accountants will give you 5 different answers because the code is so daggum complicated, like I had to go on a tax basis question on something in my wife that she's got from stock, we couldn't get the same answer out of 4 different people about what
Can I
to
say
do.
something? I agree with you, absolutely. The tax code is a labyrinth of complications driven by everybody who thinks they have one good idea that will have a positive
Correct.
effect. But put together, they're a mess.
Highly complex. So my point being on the revenue side, the gentleman from Arkansas would agree, and I assume the gentleman from Maryland would agree, that the data, that this is directly from the Fed, the data in terms of receipts. If we want to have more receipts, first, this isn't state receipts, this isn't local receipts, this is just federal receipts, that they're basically as high as they've ever been. You can go try to squeeze some more blood out of that tournament, but then that has an impact on the economy, has an impact on jobs. And so then the question becomes, that you go to the pack on cutting. Like, where do we want to go with revenue when we're at one of the 3 highest levels of revenue we've ever had as a percentage of our economy?
Yeah, if you're north of 18% of GDP, you're in what I would call positive territory. And since the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, we had record revenues. The exception being FY23. I think, don't don't hold me to these numbers, but I think it's about $450 billion less. I want to say 9% below FY '22. But I also think you should factor in to the equation the high inflation, the high interest rates, the fact that people were doing less as a result of inflationary spirals. But look, I agree on the premise that I don't think it's a revenue problem for this country. I believe it's a spending problem. But most of that spending is what we have promised Americans through very important programs, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, constructs that were developed in the 30s and the 60s, when lifespan, what was lifespan in the 1930s? What was, lifespan was probably in the 60s. And you go do this experiment on your own, but tomorrow open up your newspaper and go straight to the obituaries. And let me tell you what you're going to see. You're going to see 90, 95, 89, 88, 87. And people are in these programs a lot longer, and 10,000 people a day for the next several years are going to be entering these programs. And that's the construct that we're operating under, and precisely why the problem is not, the overall problem has less to do with what we're arguing about and a whole lot more to do with the inconvenient truth that mandatory spending is the problem with deficits and debt.
Well, I thank you both. I'm going to yield back at the, I was in a much more, no offense to anybody here, I was in a much more pleasant space yesterday with my dad celebrating the 60th anniversary of his 21st birthday at a place called New Braunfels, Texas, at Wurstfest, eating sausage and drinking beer. And then next to me, when they were celebrating that, and the guy said, the lady next to me, who lived down, she grew up in her whole life there, she goes, well, I'm 91, that's nothing. So there's a lot of that going on. Yes, Steny, I'll yield back.
Thank you very much, Mr. Roy. I want to say something that Mr. Burgess said, and it was said in the Appropriations Committee, that we made a deal, and that was a cap. Very frankly, if I negotiate with you on the purchase of your home, and you want $100,000, I want to pay you $80,000, and we agree on $90,000, I said, well, that was a cap. I'm really going to give you $82,000. That's baloney. Nobody will make deals like that. You'd be a fool to make a deal like that. One of the parts of the deal that may not be as well known was $20 billion was cut from the IRA's additional resources for IRS. But was also agreed with that $20 billion cut, that would be it. There wouldn't be more. The president wasn't going to make a deal on cutting it more than $20 billion or 25%. A little less than 25% because of $87 billion. So to say that the deal is just a little bit different is not accurate. It's substantially different because it went from fiscal year 23 to fiscal year 22 on our markups. That was not the deal. The deal was Speaker McCarthy said, we'll use 23 levels. He didn't use 23 levels, with all due respect, because the Freedom Caucus voted against the rule next week to show him that they were very disappointed in that. And as a result, we were shut down for an entire week, not just the 23 days. We were shut down then for 4 days of that week. And as a result, we marked up at 22 levels. If we'd marked up at 23 levels, it would have been a significant difference in terms of allocation of the 302B numbers. Here, Mr. Womack didn't have any numbers to deal with, except for the money we got from IRS that was agreed upon, and nobody complained about that, per se. But it would have come into the 23 numbers as well as the 22 numbers. So it was a substantial deviance from the rule, from the deal that was made by 2/3 of your members. I don't know that you voted for it, and I don't.
You can take a guess.
I can take a guess. I didn't want to say anything pejorative in terms of what you did or did not do. But the fact of the matter is, a deal was made. And when Mr. Womack talks about regular order, that was the deal. It wasn't some deal, well, we made a deal at 23, but we're going to really do 22 and a half or 22 or 21 and a half. Nobody's going to make a deal like that that is not a fool. And we made a deal.
So,
and it wasn't kept.
So
and therefore, we're having this problem now, where you're going to have a number on this side, which is going to be different from the Senate. The whole budget process was to get the numbers the same. So you were comparing apples to apples in the Senate and the House. And then, obviously, there would be difference in the internals. We would have might spent more money here, and they spent less there, and we would have had to come to grips with that.
Well, closing out, the point I'd make is the Senate, was the gentleman from Arkansas want to say something?
No.
Okay. Well, you were
Well,
settling up to the
when
mic.
when you're finished, I
For
want
the-
to correct the record on one thing.
The $14 billion that the Senate was adding in July was before we even got Milk on VA out the door, when we first passed Milk on VA. And my point that I just want to reiterate for the average American viewing this is actually the problem, right? When we talk about deals getting made, we talk about how things get done. The fact is, what we're talking about here is going through an appropriations process. The end result of the programmatic level of spending is going to be within a standard deviation, statistically speaking, of the FRA level. That's just the truth. Programmatically, what we're talking about here, depending on labor age, which is a big variable, we are talking about being right at around the 1590, 1586 spending level for the programmatic level spending. That is the stuff that actually matters.
We're counting on the Senate keeping the deal.
Well, I mean, I'm saying what we're putting out is at that level. Then the question becomes, all right, what are we doing with all of these other accounts? And this is the thing that just blows people's minds around the country, is that the idea that we're putting forward that maybe we should rescind certain spending in order to control spending further, whether that's the IRS, whether that's any other rescission accounts, for example, the Inflation Reduction Act. It's not a shock to anybody that I think that the Inflation Reduction Act is highly damaging and harmful. We disagree on that. But not just the IRS component, not just the price fixing, which is blowing the hell out of oncology drugs, killing innovation, but also the extent to which it's funding massive billion-dollar corporations to pursue a certain energy agenda at the expense of another energy agenda. I think that's a problem. Wall Street Journal says it's $1 trillion, $1.2 trillion. So yes, I happily will shout from the rooftops my desire to rescind that. There's no problem with that. That's not a violation of some earth-shattering deal to say that, hey, we're going to spend at some programmatic level that we agreed to year over year from last year. We're talking about a 1% cut, basically. All of this noise, I will agree with you guys, a 1% cut, which, by the way, we blew through in an instant when we did the CR with $16 billion of emergency spending for disaster supplemental. We just literally, in a day, in an hour, bam, $16 billion, the whole $16 billion that we're debating over to try to get a 1% cut on discretionary spending and hold the line. We're talking about $14 billion for Israel. We're going to talk about $60 billion for Ukraine or whatever the president's asking for. Well, that's $100 billion. Bam, right? That we're talking about in terms of the spending, or I guess that's probably $90 billion, of blowing the lid off of spending with so-called emergency spending. So all we're saying is maybe we should pay for this stuff as we go. I yield back. I thank you for your indulgence to your time.
Mr. Chairman, can I have 30 seconds?
Yes.
I made a comment about mandatory spending, and we've got the scribes over here recording all of this. Because my mother will turn 90 on December the 12th, I do not want my comments to be thought to be bemoaning the fact that people are living longer. I'm just making a statement of fact. And
Some of us are very happy about that.
yeah, we all should be. We should celebrate that, but
Yes.
it does complicate the construct of our social safety net program.
Sure. Thanks, gentlemen, for the clarification. Gentleman from Texas yields back. Mr. Norman of South Carolina is recognized for questions.
Thank y'all for coming. I wish I could have been here. I don't control the flights from the airlines, but this is one debate I wanted to hear. Colonel Womack,